One of the guaranteed formative experiences that you're going to have as a self-taught producer is running into a lot of the same generic advice a billion times online. You're going to see them in YouTube videos, you're going to see them in Facebook groups, you're going to see them on TikToks and Instagram Reels, you're going to see them in gear forums, and some of them are really, really great tips. Some of that advice and information actually should just be taken at face value because it's almost always a good idea. There's a lot of them, though, that are absolutely terrible advice, or they're good advice sometimes, but they need a lot more context to actually be implemented. So what I wanted to do is this week, I had a bunch of you submit on our Instagram, a bunch of different rules, a bunch of different generic advices and tips that you see a million times, and I'm going to rank them on a tier list and tell you what I think is great advice, what I think is dog shit advice, and some things that kind of fall in the middle, and I'll kind of give a little bit more context as to why I do or don't agree with it. So we're going to dive in and check all of that out in 1 second, but before we do, my name is Austin, you're watching Make Pop Music. If you like this video, please make sure you like, comment, and subscribe. That helps out our channel a ton. We do videos like this every single Friday at 10 a.m., so make sure that you subscribe so you don't miss them. And then other than that, if you want a chance to win a sample pack, preset pack, MIDI pack, or loop pack from our website, makepopmusic.com, all you have to do is leave a comment down below within the first 3 days, and we will pick a winner on our Instagram the following week. Now that all of the plugs are over, let's dive in because there is a lot of the advice that I've seen a billion times that all of you submitted. The first one on here is going to be, it's the ear, not the gear. So this advice, I think, a lot of people use as a coping mechanism to not spend a ton of money in their studio. And I think that it is just a fact that you can make a radio quality record with very whatever gear using a lot of stock plugins. You don't need to be in a $200,000 studio on $20,000 monitors with a bunch of analog gear. However, I think that when people say that, it also could promote not getting into gear or not learning a lot about gear or not finding things that kind of create a signature sound. So as I've gotten bigger as a producer, as I've gotten more established, more clients, as I've gotten a little bit bored of just making everything in the DAW, I've started getting analog synths. I've started getting outboard compressors. I've started getting better microphones. And are they making the actual song better? Sometimes I'm getting things out of a guitar pedal that I'm just not going to get out of Cubase. Sometimes I am working with an analog synth in a way that I'm just not going to work with a synth in Arturia. So while I do think that you can make a great record no matter what budget of gear you have or how much or how little gear you have, I do think that gear can be a great way to kind of implement your signature sound. And it doesn't mean it has to be expensive. It doesn't have to be this like super rare piece of gear. But for that, I'm going to put it in, I can't tell if I want to put it in B or C. I think B is like good advice, but is not always correct. Maybe that's where I'll put it. I do think that a lot of people get hung up on gear, and I think that's great advice if you're worried that your song's not going to sound good because you're using a $200 microphone. However, experiment with gear, find things that you like. Don't let that just basically give you permission to never expand your sonic palette. The next tip, and this was by far the most submitted by everybody, we probably got this exact one over 100 times, is cut all the low end / high pass, everything except for like the bass and the kick drum. This is a tip that you see a ton talked about online, and the reason that people give this tip is because there's a very limited amount of headroom in a mix, and if you have low end, it takes up a lot of headroom. So let's say you have a bass guitar, and you have drums, and you have you have electric guitar, you have acoustic guitar, and you have piano keys. A lot of that will have frequencies that dip into the lower spectrum, like 80, 90, 100. And so what a lot of people do is they'll cut everything out of, maybe everything below 100 hertz out of everything except the bass. And while it can allow the bass to have a little bit more room to open up in the mix, what can also happen is you start to just suck the life out of your instrumental. You could almost get to the point where it starts to feel thinner because you're taking away some of these low harmonics, you're taking away some of the glue that is going to gel, like that sub 50 hertz, 60 hertz information, and with kind of the lower mids around 120. Sometimes you don't want to cut everything. I think if you have a mix that's really muddy, you can get a bit surgical and start taking away low end, but you have to be careful that you don't just completely sacrifice all of the body in your entire mix because you can get carried away very, very fast. Also, you could start to introduce weird phasing issues because as you EQ, especially with things like filters, you are changing the phase of that. So if you play a C note on a guitar, a C note on a piano, and a C note on bass, and you're just kind of, doing your high pass filters all along the low end, you might start to have all of these weird, phasing issues where everything's not falling exactly where it needs to be because you are shifting the frequency response. You could also run into pre-ringing if you're using a really high Q. You could run into issues where that low pass is actually adding this weird resonant harmonic right around where you want it to be cutting, and it could just lead to more issues. So with that said, I don't think it's a bad tip. I think that a lot of people use it. I think that people can overuse it though, and I think that if you don't know exactly what or why you're cutting it, probably just don't do it. Instead, maybe just use something like a low shelf or just use like a really wide notch dip. So I'm going to put that in C. I think that it can be great, but you can easily get carried away with it. Here was another one that people talked about a ton. This is low end should always be in mono. I'm putting this in F tier. I think that we have so many listening devices that have stereo low end. We have cars where the door speakers will go down to like 60 hertz. I think that low end and mono can be great if you're doing, dance music that's being played in a club, if you're doing music that is going to be played on mono sources a lot. I understand that low end is pretty unidirectional, which means you can kind of pinpoint it no matter where it is in the stereo spectrum. However, I think that there's a lot of cool things that happen when you open up low end to being stereo. You start to allow it to fill out a mix in ways that it's not going to if you have everything under 120 hertz coming right down the middle. You could also run into some cool phasing things where you have like respaces or you have these really wide bass pads. There's tons of mixes on the radio where the 60 hertz information is stereo. And what it's doing is it's causing it to kind of flutter. It's causing it to kind of come in and come out. And it can be a really, really, really cool effect. So I don't think low end should always be in mono. I think that that is a very, very antiquated thing that happened from people mixing records for vinyl, because on vinyl, you really can't have stereo low end. It will knock the needle out of the grooves. However, in the modern age, no, low end does not need to be mono all the time. Try it out, see if you like it mono, but you don't have to collapse it if you don't want to. Here's another thing about mono. The next tip is mix in mono and check in stereo. I also hate this advice. I never mix in mono. Sometimes I'll check a mix in mono, but to me, in 2025, we have almost no sources that are completely mono. Even cell phone speakers are stereo now. Yeah, you might have like overhead speakers in a Target, or you might have a nightclub system. But in those areas, I'm not mixing so my song sounds good at negative 85 dB in the middle of a loud Target. I'm mixing it so it sounds really good and exciting in your headphones, in your car speakers, when you play it on your home TV that's stereo. So no, I'm almost never mixing in mono because I'm almost never listening in mono. And I think that it can be cool for balance to make sure things aren't stepping on each other. But all of that kind of starts to fall apart as soon as you take it into stereo, because you start sacrificing panning, you start sacrificing levels for things that aren't going to be mono in the first place. So no, I almost never mix in mono. I do the exact opposite of this, where I mix in stereo, and sometimes I'll briefly check in mono. The next thing is trust your mix or test your mix on multiple systems. Sorry, this is really tiny font for me. I think that this is B tier advice. I understand like the car test. I understand taking it from your monitors and listening in AirPods. I understand checking it on your studio headphones. And while I do think that it's important for your mix to translate everywhere, I think that what this can also do is this can also get people hyper-focused on certain areas of your mix, and then you start just overly tweaking it. Like if I mix on my stereo monitors, and then I check it in my headphones and it sounds good, and I check it in my car and it's a little bit bass heavy, I have to determine if I want to sacrifice that for it to sound less exciting on speakers, less exciting on headphones, less exciting on like a Bluetooth speaker, just so it doesn't overload my car. The thing with like a car test too is that everybody is using completely different cars. If you have a Tesla versus a Toyota Camry versus a BMW versus a 2002 Honda Civic, those are all wildly different sounding stereos. So even when you're doing the car test, it's not a true response. We're all going to be listening on different sources. The most popular is probably AirPods. So if you want to test it on a different system, test it on something like that. But other than that, I wouldn't worry about it too much. I think that you could easily pigeonhole yourself, and you could start making your mix sound worse on most of the systems that people are going to listen to because you hyperfixate on one specific system. The next thing is use reference songs when mixing and producing. I think that this is A tier advice, but it has a big caveat for me. I think that a lot of people use referencing very poorly, and they'll think that I want my low end to sound exactly like Clarity by Zed. And the issue is, if your production is different, and if you're in a different key, and if you're using different sounds, your low end is almost never going to be exactly that. Your vocal is never going to sound exactly like Sabrina Carpenter vocal, unless you're her singing that exact song in that exact key on that exact microphone. And so while yes, I think reference songs can be great to make sure you're in the ballpark, I don't think that people should be doing one-to-one references because you might be mixing your song to a reference that doesn't necessarily fit your arrangement. It doesn't necessarily fit the key that the song is in. It doesn't necessarily fit the vocalist that is singing on the song. So when I use references, I use them more in a broad sense of, I have 5 songs. If my song comes in the middle of all of these on a playlist, is it going to make people look away and be like, what the fuck is happening with this mix? It sounds way better or way worse or just way different. So that's how I use referencing. I like using it as a broad kind of like, find the ballpark that I need to be in. And then within that, I want to use my own judgment to make my specific mix the best that I think that it can be for that specific song. So yes, use referencing, but make sure that you don't mix to the reference instead of mixing to your song. The next thing is a good song can be done with just a vocal and an acoustic guitar or a piano. I agree with this in a certain sense. I think if the focus of the song is going to be the songwriting, if you want really beautiful melodies and lyrics, then yes, that song needs to work on a really stripped arrangement. So acoustic guitar, piano, whatever you want. However, some songs that might not be the exact focus. I think that there are a lot of really great songs. I think Bodak Yellow by Cardi B is a great song. I don't think that works on acoustic guitar because that's not the vibe of the song. I think that there's a lot of cool electronic songs that don't work on piano because the production is kind of the hook of that song. I think that there's a lot of rock songs that the intensity kind of dies out if you just play it on piano. So yes, I think that a good song should be able to be done on electric guitar or piano if the vocal melody and the chords and the lyrics are going to be the focus. So I'm going to put that in B tier. I think it's a good test, especially if you're making pop music, but yeah, there's tons of genres that doesn't apply for. Only make moves in plus or minus 3 dB increments. This is an F tier to me. I don't know why people say this. I guess it's so people don't overmix or start doing really insane shit that can make their whole mix fall apart. But there are times that I have a vocal and I'm mixing forever and then I walk away and I come back and I'm like, that vocal needs to be 6 dB louder. I think that making bold moves can be a cool way to kind of impart your sonic signature on a sound. And I think that if you get to the point where you're just making all of these minute, microscopic changes, the mix may not be coming together in a way that you want. I think that there are no rules for how much or how little you can EQ something, you can compress something, how much you can drive the gain, where you can pan it. I think all of that is a taste thing. And so I think 3 dB increments, it could just lead to taking a lot fucking longer to mix your song rather than just going in and making a ballsy move and pulling it off. So with that said, F tier advice, recreate songs that you like to get better at producing. Yeah, this is S tier. This is the first one that I don't think has any caveats whatsoever. I think when you're starting to produce, if you're trying to learn sound design, sound selection, arrangement, you're trying to learn how to implement dynamics, you're trying to learn why hits are hits, recreating songs as close as you can is the best way to do that. I remember when I was getting started, I would I remade Shape of You by Ed Sheeran, I remade The Hills by The Weeknd, I remade probably a couple Black Bear songs just to see if you can figure out what those sounds are. I think it's a great tool for saying, oh, this is an E piano. Oh, this is a saw synth. Oh, this is a Reese bass. This is a drum that would come from sample packs like this. This is a hi-hat that would come from sample packs like this. I think recreating songs is the best way to learn your tools, learn your taste, and just kind of start to learn what some of the intrinsic things of a hit actually are. That's S tier advice. If you feel like your production's not where you want it to be, pick a song a week and recreate it as close as you can. I promise you're going to take tips out of every single one that you do. Next one we have is Autotune on vocals is a must. I'm going to put this right in C, and I have a very specific thing that I want to talk about with this. I think that the inverse of this could also fall in C, where like nobody should ever use Autotune. I think Autotune is a great tool. I think that when I'm recording vocals or when I'm recording a vocalist, pitch is actually one of the last things that I listen for because that is the easiest to fix. And to me, that is the one that listeners care about the least in terms of emotional response. So I would rather have a really beautiful tone from a singer. I'd rather them sing it with conviction. I'd rather their inflection be really good. I'd rather their enunciation be really good. I would rather timing be good to where that vocalist is in a pocket, because pitch to me, there's only so much deviation that you can have with pitch as long as it's a decent vocal recording. And so I can fix that later. I would rather really feel a vocal. And if Autotune or Very Audio or Melodyne or any of those allow that vocalist to not focus on the pitch so much that they start to really step on their vocal ability, great. I also think that in modern productions, especially a lot of the time, if we're using a lot of software, everything is perfectly tuned all the time. If you're using software synthesizers, software pianos, software guitars, software drums, everything is so in tune that if that vocal falls out of pitch just a little bit, it is the most apparent thing you've ever heard. Where if you're doing a mix that is live guitars, live pianos, it's a live drummer that has room resonance, you have bass, where everything is kind of like microtonal, where you have everything a few cents always out of tune. I think that you can get away, as long as the vocal is sang really well, you can get away with it being a bit more pitchy, because everything is a little bit pitchy. Live elements are pitchy. A live saxophone is never going to be exactly in tune like a saxophone VST is. So the more program stuff that you have, you're probably going to find that you need to be that much more particular with tuning, because it's just contrast. It's going to stick out like a sore thumb if you're not. So I don't think autotune is always a must. However, I think it's a great tool that should not really be shamed at all. You could say the same thing about like compression. Like if you use compression, it's cheating, because vocalists should know how to control their dynamics. I just think it's such a dog shit argument, and literally every singer alive has had at least one song be produced with autotune. I can almost promise you. The next one is balance is key. If everything is loud, then nothing is loud, and if everything is wide, then nothing is wide. This is one that I've actually said myself. This got submitted quite a few times. I don't know if they were pulling it from me or from the internet in general. This is A-tier advice. I'm not going to put it quite an S, because I do think that there can be caveats where you just want like a wall of sound and shit. But for me, if I have a mix where everything is panned out 100%, everything is, maxing the volume that it can without starting to hit like a clipper or a limiter, what's going to happen is my ears can't perceive differences. So with width, it's like a psychoacoustic thing. Your brain perceives width because there's difference in timing, there's difference in tone, there's difference in tuning between left and right. So if everything is super, super wide, you're not going to be able to always discern those little microscopic differences that create width. If you have a vocal right in the middle and you have two guitars panned out 100% left and right, that vocal is going to feel super centered, and that guitar is going to feel extremely wide. If you have two vocals spread out 100% left and right with two guitars spread out left and right, what's going to happen is you're going to run into this issue where everything feels really wide, but the mix doesn't really feel focused. There's nowhere to kind of like focus in on. And so the same thing can be said with loudness and volume. I think that if you can find balance, and if you can have star elements of your mix where, this synth I want to be really, really wide, this guitar lead I want to be really, really loud, this synth, it can be just kind of narrow in the background, it's kind of just a filler. I think that that is the key for a good arrangement, a good mix, a good production. Having balance between narrow and wide, having balance between loud and soft, having balance between bright and dark. You want to fill all of the space that you possibly can, and you can only do that by balancing everything. So that's A-tier advice for me. The next one is trust your ears. This was also one of our most submitted. This one really pissed everybody off. And I don't think it's as bad as people want. I do think it's a lazy response for advice, because it's like saying water is wet. However, for me, trust your ears is basically kind of just a change on like, there's no right or wrong answer. Even this video, you shouldn't take anything I take as gospel. Your ears and your brain and your taste at the end of the day is what matters the most. However, a lot of people can't trust their ears. They might not be experienced enough. They might not be in a listening environment that they can trust. They might not be talking to clients or artists that have, trustworthy feedback. And so I do think that you should follow your instinct, but trust your ears is probably not the best words. I think follow your instinct. I think trust your taste, but I think that your ears can play a lot of tricks on you. So I am going to put that in D tier. I just think that it's not super actionable advice. And if it's not actionable, I don't think it's great advice. It's kind of just like a brainiacism where somebody's like, just trust your ears. And it's like, what the fuck is that? You hear my stomach growling? Somebody sample that. Anyway, trust your ears. It's just very whatever advice. It's so generic, and like it doesn't really mean anything, so it's going in D tier for me. I do think though that trust your opinion, trust your taste, try everything. The next thing is mix with your ears, not your eyes. I think that this is going to fall in it's going to fall in B tier. I think that a lot of the time our eyes can mislead us when we go into doing things like mixing. You might look at a frequency analyzer and see this really big peak, and so you just automatically start EQing it out. But maybe that's the fundamental frequency, and now you've just taken out all of the fucking body of that vocal or of that synthesizer, and now it just sounds thin and weird and disconnected. However, sometimes you can't trust your ears, like we just talked about in the last tip, so sometimes visual cues can be huge for helping. That's why they exist. That's why spectrographs exist. That's why phase scopes exist. That's why, panoramas exist. Your eyes can be a great tool, especially for things like checking phase, checking low end, checking, resonant frequencies. However, at the end of the day, you don't listen to a mix with your eyes, so I don't think that should be the number one thing that you follow. I see a lot of people literally start to compress things just because something looks loud, not even because it sounds loud. So yes, mix with your ears, not your eyes, but use some of those visual tools to your advantage. With that said, I also think Jeff Ellis talks about this a lot, especially in like his Mixer Brain course that he does. Shout out Jeff. But mixing with your eyes can start to play tricks on you. I think it's a great thing to just kind of like close your eyes while you adjust a gain knob, close your eyes while you adjust panning, because that will take away all of the kind of preconceived notions you have about where things should sit, how things should respond. If you just close your eyes and allow yourself to be dexterous with your hands and use your ears, I do think you can get really cool things that your brain might not let you get if your eyes see that you're boosting something by 12 dB. So I'm going to pop that in B tier. Lots of caveats, though. The next one is sidechain your bass to the kick drum. I think that this is more like a specific tool. I don't think that this is a rule that you should always be doing. I do think that similar to cutting low end out of everything, this can be a great way to have your kick cut through a mix, is if you don't have overlapping frequencies with your kick and your bass. However, sometimes that can take away from the intensity. Like I know Kenny Beats said a lot of the time, he wants his 808 and he wants his kick drum to hit at the same time because it's adding even more impact. In his mind, he's thinking, if I only want a kick to be impactful, I'll only have a kick. And if I only want an 808 to be impactful, I'll only have an 808. And if I have both of them happening at the same time, I want that impact to be hitting. So I don't think you always need to be sidechaining your kick to your bass. I think that it's more of a taste thing. I think that it really depends on how you arrange your songs. I'm popping that in C. All right, the next one is only drop singles if you don't have an audience. So this is referring to artists not dropping EPs, not dropping albums, just dropping singles to build an audience. I do think that I think it's A tier advice, but with a caveat. Some people aren't releasing music to get a big audience. Some people have the income or they have the time to self-produce. And to them, the artistry and the vibe of their project is more important than an audience. Maybe somebody's making a concept album about something really important that happened in their life, and to them, that doesn't work if you're only dropping singles. It might be worth it for their artistic integrity to drop an album all at once. However, if that's not the case, if you're just trying to make it as an artist and you're trying to have a career in music, it is so expensive and time-consuming to produce an album, and if you are dropping an album to 200 monthly listeners on Spotify, there is no way you make that money back. There is no way that time that you put into the project is actually being heard and appreciated by a bunch of people. I think that for something like that, it is important to kind of build your audience. Sustainability is key. Consistency is key. And I think that you can't really be consistent with albums unless you just have immense free time on your hand. But if that's really important to your project as an artist, then don't feel like you have to drop singles. You just have to find other ways to find your audience. All right, the next one is mix at very quiet volumes. I understand that a lot of people do this to preserve their hearing. I think that a lot of the time, the louder that you listen to a mix, it starts to do that like Fletcher-Munson curve, perceived loudness thing where it starts to almost compress itself. Like your ears can only take so much pressure before they'll start compressing sound as well. So mixing at quiet volumes does allow you to get really good balance. However, for me, there's a lot of songs that I need to feel the energy when I mix, and you can't really do that at quiet volumes. I'm almost never like blasting my speakers, but that whole notion of like you should be able to almost whisper to somebody sitting next to you while you're mixing, I don't ever really do that. I'll check it down there just to make sure I don't have any like weird loud hi-hats or loud sibilants or anything like that. But I'm almost never mixing at super quiet volumes because to me it's not exciting and it's not how I listen to music. And I don't trust my ears to take that balance into consideration. So for me personally, I'm going to go C tier with this. I know a lot of people swear by it. It's just not my cup of tea. Don't master your own mix. I'm going to put this in D tier. I think Colt Caparoon might have just made a video on it. I haven't watched it yet, but I don't know what his stance is on that. I mix a lot of my own productions and I master a lot of those as well. I think that you do lose the privilege of having somebody who is completely impartial to your mix, completely impartial to your production, that can give you cool critiques that you won't obviously have if you're just doing it to your own taste. I think that there are certain forms of mastering, like mastering for vinyl or mastering for like broadcast media, that are much more specific than just mastering for your song for Spotify. But with that said, I master so much of my own mixes. I don't think that you have to be hiring a mastering engineer, but it is a really, really good tool if you just want one more opinion, if you want one more person to make sure that that song is as good as it can be. A mastering engineer is one of the least expensive and most trustworthy ways to do that. So D tier for me. However, so much love to all the mastering engineers out of there. Don't let that dissuade you from hiring mastering engineers. The next thing is less is more. Don't overmix your songs or overlayer your arrangements. I'm going to pop this in. Oh, shit. I'm going to pop this in C tier. This is one that I think half the time is good advice and half the time it's bad advice. Sometimes a mix needs a lot. Sometimes a vocal does need 14 inserts to make it sound like how you want it to sound. Sometimes it's a creative choice. Sometimes there is a lot of fixing that you might have to do in the mix that you don't want to be doing. So sometimes you do need to do a lot of things. Sometimes the arrangement will call for 200 tracks. However, sometimes that vocal sounded just fine without any plugins on it, and maybe it needed one little tiny EQ curve, and that's all it needed, but you lost the plot. You just kept going back and you kept tweaking. And then once you tweak something, then you have to fix that. And then you have to fix that. And the next thing you know, you have 3 compressors, 4 EQ, 4 de-essers, 2 reverbs, 3 delays. And all the thing really needed was like a plate delay and 1 little EQ. So don't add more just to add more. I think this is where critical thinking comes in. When you're mixing or when you're producing, there should be a vision. And if you run into problems, you should have a background with the tools or the techniques that it takes to overcome those problems. However, don't do things just to do things. And sometimes break those rules, find new fun ways to do things. The next one is analog is better than digital. I'm going to put this in D tier. I don't think it's better. That's the key word. I think analog is just different than digital. I think it's more of a workflow thing than like a sonic quality to me. I like sometimes committing things with analog. I like playing live synths. I like running things through guitar pedals. I do think that there is some analog gear that can't really be modeled that well just because it is more of a workflow thing. Modular synthesis to me is a great example of like in person, it's so much fun to patch up a mod synth. Inside a DAW, it's miserable. I almost never use it. So analog is not better than digital necessarily. I think digital can speed up workflow. Digital is the easiest thing ever to recall. Digital is a way that you can get so many tools for such a limited budget. However, analog has a lot of sauce that I think a lot of people just write off. It's again like the trust your, or it's the ear, not the gear kind of argument from earlier. Analog can have some really cool shit. I don't think you should write it off just because you want to like live and die by the sword of being a digital producer or a digital mixer. The next thing is take frequent breaks to reset your ears. That's S tier advice. It gets really loud in the studio. Our ears can only handle so much noise before they literally start responding different. Maybe every hour, take like 5 minutes, just step away, walk into a quiet room, turn the monitors off, do whatever you got to do. Reset the ears as often as you possibly can. The next one, there are no rules. If it sounds good, it is good. I think that's actually A tier advice. With the caveat of like, obviously some things are objectively wrong, but objectively wrong could be creatively right. So, you know, we've been talking about McGee a lot on the channel lately. His albums are produced so wrong for a modern record. There is lots of noise. There is flubs on the guitar. There is mono flanging that just sounds really, really chaotic and weird. However, it all creates a sonic aesthetic. And I think that if he were to follow one of our Make Pop Music videos where we're making really polished, buttoned up pop music, I think his album gets worse. However, if I make a radio pop record similar to that radio pop record might never go because it's such a specific creative taste. So I do think that there are no rules. With that said, you should learn the rules so then you can consciously break them to achieve a specific outcome. The next thing is don't over compress. I don't know. To me, it's like C tier. It's, again, one of those like very whatever statements of sometimes a vocal needs 20 dB of compression. Sometimes it needs nothing. Sometimes a mix needs a little bit of compression for glue. Sometimes compression literally starts to make a mix feel one-dimensional and shitty. So learn what a compressor is, learn how to use it, and learn how you like to use it. always boost or always cut, never boost with EQ. That's F tier. I don't know why that trend started. Boosting with EQ is literally, there are some EQs that specifically only boost. If this were a true rule, those wouldn't exist. I think that rather than, boosting a ton, sometimes you could just do a really, really minimal cut and it could even out that frequency balance. Again, balance is key. EQ is just another proponent of that. You have to think when you're cutting something, your ears are going to perceive everything that did not get cut as louder. So it will feel brighter. It will feel, a little bit more open. And if you start to boost things, it's kind of the inverse. If you're boosting a bunch of high mids, it's going to take away a little bit of that sizzly top end. It's going to take away a little bit of that low end because you're going to accommodate that level in the volume based on just total perceived loudness in the mix. And if now that is more mid-heavy focused, the high mids and the mids, they're going to come through a lot more, so you're going to get less of all of the other frequencies. However, always cut, never boost is insane advice. Don't ever listen to that. Never listen / mix in solo. That's D advice. I think that there's a lot of things that can be a lot easier to pinpoint in solo. So if you are mixing and you hear something that you feel like the kick drum compression is just a little bit wonky, or you feel like the vocal reverb is just a little bit too long or too dense, soloing something could be a great way to pinpoint. However, I don't think you should be doing a lot of your mix in solo. You shouldn't be doing your main EQ in solo. You shouldn't be doing your main compression in solo, because a mix and a production, everything needs to come together. And if you're doing all of that in solo, you're making each individual element sound the best. However, that might not be the best thing for the mix. So I think mix with your whole project being audible. But if you need to solo to pinpoint frequencies, pinpoint compression, pinpoint attack and decay, like that's fine. I think solo is a great tool for that. Otherwise, you might never be able to really figure out what's going on under the hood. The next thing is you can't fix a bad performance in the mix. I think that this is kind of just a new version of saying like get it right at the source, and I think that's A tier advice. I think that a bad performance is always going to sound like a bad performance, even if Serban mixes it or if, Manny American mixes it. A bad performance just is still bad. Like, no amount of production is going to fix it. No amount of mixing is going to fix it. No $20,000 microphone is going to fix it. Get a good source, get a good performance on decent gear that's not going to inhibit you later. And then other than that, make the song the best it can be. And then the last one, a good arrangement is a key to a good mix. I saw somebody that had sent this one and they disagreed with it. I actually really agree with it. I think that this is going to go into B tier. I think there's a lot of good arrangements that get a bad mix, and I think that there's a lot of bad arrangements that can get a fairly good mix. But when I hear a perfect mix, it is because that mix had room to shine because the arrangement is so good. There's not a million elements stepping all over each other. There is room for the vocal to be mixed. There is room for the bass drum to feel huge. There is room for the synths to be super wide and lush. I think of a song like Got Me Started by Troye Sivan. That mix is absolutely incredible, but that production is as incredible as the mix. It's open. It's wide. It was beautifully crafted. Ian Kirkpatrick is a master at arrangement and layering. And so I think of a song like that. I bet his rough mix was better than 99% of people's mixes. Final. However, that final mix gets perfect because the mixing engineer can tweak it that 5% that they need to really take it over the edge, and the arrangement allows them to do that. There's a lot of the times I've gotten hired to mix where the arrangement is just so cluttered and claustrophobic. No matter what I do in the mix, it is always going to sound small and tight and overcrowded. So with that said, focus on the arrangement before you focus on the mix. But that is all my advice. This video ran kind of long. There was over 20 things that you guys responded with. We even have more in our DMs. A lot of these got responded to many times, but I would love to hear how you agree or disagree with any of this advice. Leave it down below. Also, like I said before, if you want to leave a comment in the first 3 days, you can win a sample pack, preset pack, MIDI pack, or loop pack from our website, Make Pop Music. If you do want to support us after this video, head over there. There is links in the description. We have courses. We have tons of free content over there as well. Go check it out. Best way to show us some love. Other than that, subscribe because we'll be back next Friday with another video. But until then, much love. Peace.